Welcome everybody to our Industry Expert Forum. We're talking about third-party hearing aid strategies today, and we're going to start a little bit after the top of the hour. Welcome, make yourself comfortable. Welcome everyone. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to get started in about 1 minute just to make sure everybody who wanted to join was able to get there. I still see people joining, so we're just going to give it a few more seconds. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. We're very excited about the talk that we have for you today. I'm Dr. Rose DeLude. I'm the Director of Audiology for Fuel Medical, and I welcome you to the next hour where we get to talk about everybody's favorite topic in hearing healthcare, and that is, of course, third-party hearing aid strategies. A couple of housekeeping things. I will be monitoring the chat for any questions that you might have. The chat is open on my screen. When you chat or ask questions, the only people that are going to be able to see that will be me and the other panelists. But please feel free to pop everything in. We're going to do Q&A at the end. We have so much content to go through. We want to make sure we get through the content, and you will have time for your questions when we are finished. So to introduce the topic, a topic that we're all very familiar with, I'd like us to think about hearing healthcare almost as an ocean, and that we have hearing healthcare with all of these different team members that take care of our patients, that are working to create the best outcomes and the best experiences that we can possibly have for patients. And if it is an ocean, it means that there are lots of eddies and tides and currents, and dare I say, a few sharks in the water. And it's really hard when you're swimming in the ocean to be able to have a perspective to see exactly where the industry is going. Sometimes it's kind of hard for you to see even where your practice is going. And so we have assembled the A team today, people with unique perspectives, because not only have all of us been in the day-to-day providing healthcare to patients, but we also are part of organizations that are able to give us a really wide macro view of where some of these currents are going. So in the A team, we have panelists here that have so much industry experience that we've decided to decline trying to do the math because it's just too large of a number. And we're actually going to get started with Dr. Keith Matheny. Unfortunately, Dr. Matheny, because of scheduling conflicts, had difficulty being able to get on at the same time as we are, but we are very grateful for him setting aside some time and doing a pre-recording for us. So, Will, can I ask you to move to Dr. Matheny's recording, please?
Certainly.
Thank you.
All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Will, for having me as part of this illustrious panel. and providing from at least a 10,000-foot view the perspective of a physician.
Apologies for that. 1 second here.
So I am Keith Matheny. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon in Dallas, Texas. And I specifically do a lot of sinus and sleep management. But within our practice, we have a very robust audiology department in partnership with Fuel. And then I do several other things adjacent to my practice. I run multiple companies, healthcare related, a couple medical device companies, one healthcare technology company called Sleep Vigil that monitors sleep apnea patients. But where we partner with Fuel on a much bigger basis is at USENT Partners. USENT is a ENT specific buying group, very much like Fuel is for the hearing aid part of a practice. USENT fills in the rest of the clinic. So we work hand in glove with Fuel and hundreds of physician offices around the country, providing savings on their sinus balloons, on allergy supplies, on sleep diagnostics, capital equipment, you name it. And so Fuel is near and dear to my heart, and I'm very honored to participate. So I will share my screen. I just, again, wanted to open with a few remarks from a physician's perspective. I pull that up. From my perspective, the topic for discussion today is what role does a third-party payer play in the audiology department? And traditionally in my practice and in many practices, the answer was not much. Our hearing aid department in our practice is about 50 years old. And so for the most part, we have been a cash pay model. And we have been blessed with tens of thousands of patients over the year that have been very happy with that. But the market has changed even before COVID and certainly since COVID. And we know there are even larger market changes, such as over-the-counter hearing aids and other types of technologies that patients can now choose from. And so as physicians, as audiologists, partners, we certainly are partners with our audiologists in this business. We have gradually embraced the third-party payer. Now, being part of large IPAs, independent physician associations that negotiate contracts, we have learned that we can't just accept all of the contracts. This is a situation where you must read the fine print. And we'll talk more about that in a couple slides, but just starting at the top, third-party payers in our audiology department are becoming more and more important. My philosophy for our audiology department is that we must differentiate ourselves from the over-the-counter technologies, from other competing models. And the way we do that is because we are blessed with amazing audiologists, and the patient audiologist relationship in our practice keeps them within our practice. They really wouldn't be tempted by some of the alternatives they have in the marketplace, even if they're paying a little bit more. And so what we've chosen to do is to embrace third-party payers. In our practice, we have chosen not to yet embrace over-the-counter hearing aids. I encourage you to listen to the presentation that Rose and Dan will give here in a few minutes, but also obtain the recording of the amazing presentation that they did at the Ascent meeting a couple of weeks ago on this topic. But for our practice, that just isn't right at this time. And so we're focusing on doing the best we can with our patients through our audiologists. We also run a practice that's very embracive of all technologies and all surgical procedures. And so when we see a patient that comes into us for hearing loss, or we identify that they have a hearing loss, maybe they came in for another reason, we make sure that we simply educate them on what's out there. We educate them certainly on the pros and cons of the over-the-counter products, which as a blanket statement are not as sophisticated. even if some of the inner workings of those instruments are similar to the higher end hearing aids that we all provide our patients, we know that the experience with an audiologist is much different. And we work with their insurance companies to help them obtain those hearing aids in a financially achievable way. We also talk about surgical procedures and maybe alternative hearing technologies too, just so the patient is fully informed. But the key is we view our audiologists as differentiators. You know, it's different than a patient just walking into any old place that does hearing aids. We really try to be an educational resource, to be a low pressure sale point, and to do everything we can to help them if they do have insurance coverage. Again, Dan and Rose will talk about this extensively, but are there positive aspects to third-party payers to over-the-counter hearing aids? I would say yes. I tend to be pretty optimistic in general from a business standpoint. And to me, I feel like over-the-counter hearing aids are going to reach part of the potential market that we're currently not reaching. I think there's a mental hurdle. We all know when a patient finally admits to themselves, okay, I have problems here. And then the next mental hurdle, probably more so for males than females even, is I don't want to look old by wearing hearing aids. And what we all know is that you look old when you can't hear. And especially with the recent data that's come out about the connection between dementia and unaided hearing loss, these are things that we champion within our patient relationships. And so I think over-the-counter hearing aids will help some people get over that mental hurdle. And then they'll try those instruments and maybe they're not that satisfactory, but hopefully many of them will then be open-minded to seek an audiologist, to seek an ear, nose, and throat physician to finally be placed in a higher end device that will help them. Same with managed care. We all know the price points for higher end hearing aids. And for many people, especially after COVID, that's just not achievable. And so that's all the more reason that I think we need to be embracive of partnering with insurers that pay a reasonable rate, that respect our professionalism, respect the amount of follow-up, because so much of that is included in our cost, or our costs that we pass on to the patient. And so I think it's positive. One of my favorite books, business books, is Who Moved My Cheese? And the whole premise is that what works today is probably not going to work tomorrow, and for sure won't work the day after that. And so we have to constantly stay lean and agile and continue to pivot. And I think this is a great opportunity for us. Last slide I'll show, and then you can listen to the other folks. When you are contracting with these insurance companies, read the fine print, get some help evaluating these contracts. It's very easy, and I know many people within USENT and even just colleagues have taken a blanket approach and accepted insurance for hearing aids, and they realize that they're not able to justify the little amount that they're reimbursed over what they're paying wholesale for the hearing aids. They're not able to justify the amount of audiology time it takes for the patient to have a good experience, to be properly fit and programmed, to have the proper service for years to come. And so what we've done in our practice, we just have a handful of insurers that we take. And the rest of our patients, either we provide them with a provider in our market that does take their insurance plan, or what we prefer to do is say, listen, we would love to take care of you, we'll arrange financing, what have you, but we believe so strongly in our audiologists here and that you will achieve the maximum result with your hearing instruments that we'd like to keep you here, even if it's cash pay for you. So hopefully that at least kicks off the discussion, and obviously this will lead to many future discussions. So I'll turn it over to Rose and my colleagues, and thank you for your time.
Boy, Dr. Matheny touches on a whole lot of subjects that are worth diving into. There's so much that is going on and so many different currents in our hearing healthcare industry to pay attention to. And of course, his perspective is quite unique. You know, I had a conversation with him a couple of weeks ago, and we were thinking back to when we had started seeing patients decades ago. And we said, wow, remember when it was just about seeing the patients? And it wasn't necessarily about managing the billing and the perspective of the finances. So I'm very pleased that he was able to do that recording for us. Up next, we have my friend and colleague for many years, Dan Quall, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Fuel Medical Group. And Dan, I know that you spend so much time looking at this particular aspect of hearing healthcare, and it's been years now that you have been planning and sorting and diving into this particular subject. I'm very excited to see what you have to show for us today.
Thank you, Rose. And yes, it's true. Decades is the right word for my career. Over 4 decades now in the profession of audiology in the industry of hearing aids. And certainly I've had the opportunity to watch the market change. One of the things that, when Dr. Matheny references Who Moved My Cheese, we've seen disruptions in the market, but we are seeing probably more upheaval right now than we've seen in the past. And I think one of the biggest things that we can take away is how important it is for us to be responsive to change. What I like about today is I'm going to kind of give you a perspective on where the market is for the next 15 to 20 minutes. But Will Dials and his team have done a great job of collecting evidence. And we finally have the data that shows where we can have these third party, and this is what we're going to focus on. Where can we include the third party into our practices, and where do we need to maybe look at starting to move away from them? And so I think you'll want to take a look at the case studies and make sure you see the great evidence that we have to look at this third party market and how we can operate inside of it. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to start by just talking about the market. And when we started looking and analyzing it, one of the things that we did is we went to the manufacturer data and we looked at who is purchasing the hearing aids. So what this slide represents is who actually pays for the product from the manufacturer. And that tells us the channels then that have developed in the marketplace. So if you're a manufacturer in the hearing aids, you look at these different channels and you say, how are we going to attack each of these markets in order to get our products into the marketplace? And what you'll see, and for example, in the first column is the VA. The VA is right now 18% of the marketplace. And so we know almost 1 out of 5 hearing aids today fit in the United States is purchased by the VA. And you can see across the line, there's 4 majors. You've got managed care, you've got retail channels, and independent. Now, what's startling about these channels is the changes that have taken place over the last several years. Independent channels, which is still the largest, is the fastest shrinking channel. Fewer hearing aids are purchased by independents via the manufacturers today than there was significantly fewer than there was 5 years ago. Retail channel continues to grow. 26% of the market is retail. It's primarily made up of Costco. That Costco is probably between 14 and 16% of that total retail channel. And it continues to grow. It's the second fastest growing channel in the market. But the fastest growing is our managed care. It is at 22. 5 years ago, this was at approximately 15%. And so what we're seeing is a just very fast growth in the managed care side of the business. So the question becomes, what is my strategy moving forward? How do I deal with this fast growing part of the marketplace? What do I need to do as a clinic to make sure that we are dealing with the patients in the appropriate way? So let's go to the next slide. What's created by this channel has been a hierarchy, and I think everybody's familiar with this. Medicare Advantage is what's driving this part of the market at this point, and they created a hierarchy, whereas the patient signs up for a health insurance, mostly through the Medicare Advantage space. But the health insurance don't want to manage the hearing aid benefits by themselves. So what they do is they contract with a hearing aid benefit provider. And you see those in the third line there: Nations Hearing, True Hearing, United Health. These are all samples of players in this market. And today there's about 14 of them that are out contracting all across the US. It's gotten that way because this has turned into big business. For the Medicare Advantage space, the insurance companies have found that providing the Medicare services to seniors has turned into a very large business. And by providing a variety of benefits, they can attract the patients into their insurance contracting. So let's take a look at the next slide and see what's bringing those people to us. So first of all, let's talk about the types of contracts we deal with in the marketplace. So as a provider in the market, you're going to see primarily three buckets for different types of contracts. First is the discount plans. These are groups that have taken pricing on hearing aids and then reduced them. We see a lot of it with like the Farm Bureau, those kinds of programs where they just have basically a discount. And what we find is most clinics can compete with those head to head. They don't need to have a special treatment plan or option for this. Defined benefits are those insurance groups that have established a direct cost of, say, the best one would probably be the federal retired employees, where they get $2,500 every 5 years. It's a defined benefit that they get. Now, it is contracted through one of our big groups, but you can still bill that direct to the insurance company, and they'll pay you directly. And so that is defined, and we can deal with those head to head as they come through our offices and bill the insurance and collect the money directly. But the one that's taking a big space out there is the Medicare Advantage. And these, of course, are contracted through our hearing aid TPAs, third-party hearing aid benefit programs, and they control the whole referral all the way to the product being ordered, and they pay just a fitting fee. And so this is the strategy that we're really focusing on today. So let's go to the next slide. Here's the Medicare space. You can see the growth. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this slide because we know what's happening. But today, 42% of the Medicare beneficiaries have some kind of a Medicare Advantage plan. Now, this is a little bit deceptive because if we would line up 100 individuals who turn 65 today, almost 65% of them would select a Medicare Advantage plan. So we're seeing a real swing. And the reason is the benefits that are being put into these programs to attract patients to come to them. Let's go to the next slide and look at those benefits. So what you'll see is that the five top leading benefits is vision, telehealth, dental, fitness, and hearing aids. And if you take those top five, what's really surprising is the number one fastest growing category is hearing aids. Only 5 to 7 years ago, that number was about 40%. And today it's 72% of all the plans carry some kind of hearing aid benefit. But the issue is that a lot of these benefits vary. And so what's really important as clinicians, as we move forward, is what is being offered by each of these, both to the patient and to the clinician or the clinic. And we have to take and evaluate those very carefully. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the revenue side. And really it is about when do I want to join them and when should I beat them? We are not today advocating that clinics should abolish or not do the Medicare Advantage plans totally. We think that there are business conditions that dictate when you should be with them and when you should not. And that's what the evidence that we'll show you today is starting to become more clear as we look at the different types of clinics in the marketplace. So next slide. So here's our rule of thumb. So we look at it from two vantage points. One is a revenue. So how much the revenue does a clinic generate annually? And I look at this from a per provider basis. And so we look at this as generally a single provider in a single location. And then we also want to look at capacity. Now, obviously, there are going to be clinics that have multiple providers, and which changes the revenue slightly. But if you're a clinic whose annual revenue is under $500,000 a year, and your schedule is only booked out, say, a week or less, then you want to be in network with these plans whenever possible, as long as it makes financial sense. And so what we're looking at with a clinic in this part of their development is that they're growing, and many of them are startups. And so what's most important for them is that for every possible time slot in their schedule, they want to be generating some revenue. And these programs, the Medicare Advantage programs, can be very beneficial in driving patients into our clinics. As you start to grow between the 500 to 750,000, all of a sudden we start to get a crowding in our time. And so the schedule starts getting booked 2 weeks out. And then what we want to do is we want to start taking a position of, I want to be in network with only the best contracts. So what I want to start doing is really what Dr. Matheny was talking about, is read the fine print, read and understand what is being paid for and what is not being paid for in the contract, and do the math and say, which ones do I want to be in and which ones do I not want to be in? You can be much more selective in this environment. And then finally, if we look at the clinics that are doing $750,000 to $1 million or above. Again, this is primarily one provider. They may have assistants or techs, but what we want to, and their schedule is booked 3 weeks out. These clinics really can focus on private pay, and you'll see the difference between a private pay and a Medicare Advantage plan patient as Will goes through his data. So when we started looking at this and putting this all together, it gave us the ability to start looking at what strategically can we do at the clinic level to satisfy each of these different factors. So let's go to the next slide. So number one, start with what is the value of a contract. So we have to take a look at what the required clinical procedures are with the contract. And more importantly, we have to look at what the time is required to provide the services under that contract, because we like to say it's not what they pay that's important. It's what you have to do for what they pay that is important. And so what we can do is when they ask us to fit and provide services for the hearing aid, we have to make an estimation of how much time is that going to take and what are they paying? And that allows us to do a calculation, which we look at and we call it revenue or margin per clinical hour. Let's go to the next slide. So here's an example of what that would look like. If somebody said, a contract said, I'm going to pay you $1,000. Okay, that sounds great. Well, what we know from time studies is that in the first year, you're going to spend about 4.5 hours. And I've broken that out by times based on the eval, the fit, and then your follow-ups. The second year you can see is another 1.5, and the third year is 2 hours. So if this contract came to you and they said, we're going to pay you $1,000 and we are asking you to provide services for the first year, then I could take and say 1,000 divided by 4.5 is $222 per hour. So I'm going to use that as a reference as to whether I accept or I don't accept. And based on we love numbers right around $250 a clinical hour. We'll live with up to $150 a clinical hour. So I would say, oh, that might not be a bad thing, particularly if I'm in that 0 to 500,000 area, I'd accept this. If I'm in the 500 to 750 area, I would probably strongly consider it. If I was above that, I'd probably be looking at the private pay. But if this contract said to me, I'm going to ask you to take care of this patient for 3 years, I know I'm going to have 8 hours into that patient. And so now I'm making $125 an hour. That's well below our thresholds. And that's where, as a clinic, we start to say, I'm sorry, we can't accept or be in network with this contract. Let's go to the next. So as a reference point, here's, we've calculated out the revenue per hour. If you look at a premium product with 4 years of services, so I call this your premium treatment package. It's going to have 3 years of services 4 years of services along with the premium products that you offer. You're going to make about $330 per clinical hour. Our baseline for a single provider aggregate annually, if we look at the median practice, single provider, single location, is about $250 revenue per hour. And so these become our benchmarks. Next slide. So once I've established whether I want to be in network or out of network, my next thing is I want to create a strategy that is an alternative treatment plan. So one of the things we observed with the clinics that we work with is that anytime somebody comes in with a Medicare Advantage plan and somebody does not have an alternative treatment plan, then what they're trying to do is they're trying to present their premium treatment plan, which is going to have generally 3 years of services along with their very best products against the TPA's treatment plan, which is usually 1 year and what we like to call one-off or knockoff products. And so they'll ask you to do the fit and they'll ask you to do the services, but it's really a difference between comparing apples and oranges. So the first thing we want you to understand and make sure you do is when you read the contract, make sure you understand what they're asking you to do for the contract, but just as important, understand what they have not contracted to do. So in many cases, we see audiologists and hearing instrument specialists giving away services that don't need to be given away for free. It's not part of the contract. So take a look carefully. They've got some examples up there. I mean, some of it could be providing reprogramming. Some of it could be doing cognitive screening. These things are things you can bill for. They're not part of the contract, but yet you provide them as services to the patient because you're doing the very best job you can. We need to make sure we bill for those procedures. Let's go to the next slide. Don't give your services away. So how do I compete with the big box? And so let's go to our apples and oranges. And I don't mean to be too corny here, but I think it's the easiest way for us to really talk about the differences. Because again, when we watch the clinics deal with the people coming in with Medicare Advantage plans, what we saw was that they were trying to sell their premium 3-year package against this 1-year program. And it was like two different treatment plans. And so what we find from a behavioral economics, you're in a much stronger position if you create an alternative treatment plan so that the patient knows that you have something that's comparable. And here's the analogy is if a patient is looking for an orange and they come into your clinic and you only have apples, then you have a bias. You think apples are the best thing, and you will convince the patient that that's what they want to do. But in the patient's mind, they're going to say, they're pushing apples because that's all they have. But if they come in and they're shopping for an orange, you say, I have oranges, but guess what? I also have apples. Then I can do the pros and cons of those two and let the patient be a consumer and let them choose what they want. And what we found is a very great strategy for moving patients into private pay. So a primary treatment plan, your primary products with your primary service package, 85% of the market is still bundled, but it can work with unbundled also. And then go to a treatment plan B, which is secondary products. These are not your premium products, but it also have an alternative service plan. And generally it's 1 year so that it gives the patient an option and it compares then to their TPA service plan. Next slide. So when we created a treatment plan B, what we did is we call it a discount program. It has comprehensive professional services, so we're keeping them in the medical model, which we think is critically important. We have flexible product offerings. We think that's one of the things you have to look at in reviewing products is to make sure the contracts we do not like are the ones that have low reimbursement, but also have no product flexibility where the patient is buttonholed into maybe one product line. And then finally, the ability to provide extended services and do an unbundled approach for patients who need additional work. Next slide. So let's look at the financial side. I just wanted to give an example. Here's our apples and oranges. We did this at 2 different technology levels because we find the strength, if you do a SWOT analysis of TPAs, their strength is really in the premium and advanced lines of products. Most clinics can compete head to head with what's being offered in the mid-level and lower level hearing aids. So if we look at the premium and the advanced technologies, when we look at a bundle price, what we see is that we have a gross margin of $37.75. And so if we look at that over a 3-year period of time, you can see that that margin per hour is $4.72. But if a third party member comes in and they're going to pay you $75 for the test and $800 for the fit, and they're asking for, and it has a 3-year warranty on the product, but 1 year of services, what we know is you're going to have 4.5 hours into that product. It's paying $194. That's starting to get a little bit thin. We created that alternative program. So this is your private pay. It goes head to head with the third party. And what's important to understand is in the hearing aid market, we have a phenomena, well, any product market has a phenomena called price elasticity. And hearing aids are highly inelastic, meaning that we could vary the prices significantly and it really won't change the demand a lot. But what we find in the hearing aid world is that if you're within about $1,000 of a transaction from location A to location B, that is not enough to move the patient. It has to be greater than $1,000 before the patient really moves. So with our alternative program, we created a price point with 1 year of services, but notice the cost of goods. This is a secondary line of products. It's not our premium products that we do on a day-to-day basis. And we were able to contract with 5 of the leading manufacturers. Only one manufacturer opted out of this program to provide a what we call one-off or knockoff product. That means they're highly robust hearing aids. So instead of, for example, Oticon, instead of a more, it's the open products. And we can get our cost of goods somewhere between $550 and $600 for a rechargeable product. Once that's done, this is exactly what the TPAs have done. They've reduced their cost of goods. Suddenly we have a lot more margin to work with. We can keep our patients into a private pay scenario. It's within the price range we need, which I'll show you in the next slide. But you can see we moved to a $349 per clinical hour. That's a significant increase, not quite double, but again, it's $150 more than you saw from the TPA. But let's take a look at it from the patient side. We want to make sure it's fair on their side. So this looks at what the patient's out-of-pocket costs would be. So in the bundled scenario, you can see their out-of-pocket cost on a premium product in the Apple is $6,200. In the third party, their out-of-pocket cost, if they were to buy an extended warranty and get services for 3 years, because we want to make the service packages the same, 3 years bundled, 3 years service, the out-of-pocket for the patient would be $2,885. And if we applied that same $895 for a service package to a access hearing plan, that's what we call this program, we can see that it's at $3,490. And that's $600 difference, but well within the $1,000 delta that we think is acceptable for patients. And that made the difference between $194 per clinical hour and $349 per clinical hour, which is acceptable in a revenue management criteria for clinics. So let's go to the next slide. So to prove this, we did a case study, and then we're going to move into Will's and take a look at it. His data that he has from a number of different clinics that really supports this. We had a large ENT practice that was in the Midwest, and they had over 70% of their patients in third-party discount. And so what we did in January of 2018, we created a strategy that was an alternative to the third-party pay. We created treatment plan B, or the orange. So let's go to the next slide. Let's take a look at what it did. So you can look at 2016 and 2017. You can look at the third-party pay and how it was growing. And then you take a look at 2018 and 2019 when we look at doing an alternative plan, and you see the third party shrinking. What it tells us that these net hearing, and you can look at the net hearing aids as they grew over time. Yes, we saw a reduction in 2018 of overall units, but that quickly grew when we focused on the private practice. And you can see the number of private practice, or excuse me, private pay patients that grew in 2019. And now we've got the managed care under control. Let's go to the next slide. This takes also a look at the product mix. Now, what's really important here, and what was startling to us in this initial case, was that we had a huge change from the 70%, as much as a 35% change from the third party to the private pay. Well, we would expect all those products to be those secondary, the treatment plan B products. But what we found is that was not the case. Over half of the time when the patients were presented with a treatment plan that was robust, they're your best premium products, treatment plan A, they chose that over a treatment plan B, even though it was more expensive. So we have to let consumers be consumers. We have to be able to have the ability to talk to them about the different plans and let them choose how they want to treat their hearing. And I think that was one of the startling things we found with this, is that when given the opportunity, the patients will reach for the 3-year or more treatment plans over a 1-year treatment plan. Next slide. And this takes a look then just at the revenue. So you can see that after 2017, we saw the revenue of the TPAs go down, while we saw our private pay revenue go up. And so I think you can see in this case study, we proved that, yes, if we provide a secondary alternative treatment, we have a great discussion with the patient. They can make a choice of how they want to be treated. Next slide. So to add a competitive program, like anything, people do not run your business. Processes and programs run your business. People run the processes and programs. So the strategy is you do the math. Am I in or am I out? And depending on the size of your clinic and how full your schedule is, you can make that decision. Create treatment plan B, something that goes head to head with the TPAs. By the way, another good surprise out of this program was it goes great against Costco. And so this was a great strategy to go against the Costco folks when they come into the clinic. Create your treatment plan, create your protocol, develop your materials so that you can have a great conversation with the patients and really show them the difference between a robust treatment program with your premium products versus a secondary treatment program that's being created by the TPAs with single year and limited products. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Rose. We'll have some great information to look at. So I'm really excited for everybody to see what we found as we work with these programs across the country.
You know, Dan, I think it's, I always appreciate it when we're able to take a really big problem or challenge and start to break it into decision-making processes that are small problems and challenges to be met. So if we make these and we take the emotion out of it, we make it dispassionate so that we're making data-driven decisions, because we know, of course, that that's the best way to do this. Our gut instinct is always to feel a little encroached upon, or what do we do when there's some fear involved in it? But you do a magnificent job of breaking it into truly dollars, cents, minutes. And we got there until you said, you totally dispassionate, until you reminded us of Costco. And then it flares up again, right? So we sit there being concerned. But this is very cool. I want to introduce you all to Will Dials if you don't know him. He is a practice consultant and does a wonderful job of putting numbers together. And he actually has this fantastic KPI tool that allows him to look at over 150 practices to gather this data. So again, looking at trends within the industry. And Will, please tell us where your focus is, please, for this for these KPIs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rose. Thanks, Dan, Dr. Matheny. Yeah, so one thing that's been really interesting and useful with having data from so many practices all over the country in a variety of different types of clinical settings and regions is the ability to take that data and aggregate it so we can look at some industry trends from a fairly high level. And as Rose mentioned, this data set that we're working with contains approximately 150 unique locations, which is obviously not the entirety of the hearing aid market, but certainly a good sample size and very representative of the private practice market specifically, as opposed to big box stores or corporate-owned retail outlets, which have some different market dynamics going on. So when we're looking at this issue of the growth of managed care in the private practice space, I think it's really important that we have a clear and sober understanding of what has happened historically, kind of how we got here and where things might be headed. So let's get into just a little bit of background. What you're seeing here on the screen is the number of net hearing aid units sold annually going back to 2015, broken out by private pay and third party. As you can see, the third-party units shown in green make up a fairly small percentage of the total units going back to 2015 and 16, but over the subsequent years, we've seen quite a bit of growth. And now it's making up a sizable chunk of the overall units the past couple of years. So if we look at the growth rates by year, first on the private pay side, we can see that, at least in our data set, the private pay units have grown on average during this time period about 12% each year. And when we look at the growth rates for the TPA units, however, it's clear, as we've already talked about today, that this segment of the business is growing much more rapidly with a little over 50% average year-over-year growth during the same time period. And if we look at what this has done to the market, as a percentage of the total, we can see, of course, going back to 2015 and 16, the TPA percentage is tiny. It doesn't even show up on the chart. But after rapid growth over the last few years, we are now seeing approximately 27% of all units running through the third-party channel. Okay, so what kind of an impact is this having to the bottom line? let's pull up that same data we were just looking at here, which is that TPA percentage of total units by year. And again, we're approaching 27% as of this year. And what we can see when we bring in the gross margin per unit over that same time period, we see a really clear inverse relationship between third-party percentage and profitability. As the TPA percentage rises, the gross margin per unit is falling. And another way to look at this data that I think is helpful, when we break out the units by third party and private pay, starting in 2021, so last year and this year to date, which is really when managed care seems to have gotten a big foothold. We can see that just over 25% of all units have gone through the third party channel. But what's interesting is when we look at gross margin in the same way, so we break out gross margin dollars by third party and private pay during the same time period, we can see that we only generated 11.5% of the total profit from those third-party units. So 25% of the units we are fitting to patients are responsible for only 11.5% of the profit. And to break it down at the transaction level, the average gross margin per third-party sale during this time period, 2021 and 2022, is $862. On the private pay side, it's much higher at $2,238. So roughly $400 and change for each third-party unit, from the fitting fees paid by the third-party administrators, and a little over $1,100 in gross margin per unit on the private pay side once you've backed out your cost of goods sold. So a while back, we created a metric called TPA multiple, which the idea is to measure the number of third-party sales you would need to do to generate the same profit margin from one private pay sale. And since 2021, that number is 2.6. So what that means is that you need to sell 2.6 third-party patients to generate the margin of only one private pay patient. Okay, and another interesting way to look at the impact of third party and the growth is by looking at revenue per hour, something Dan talked about earlier. So here we have on this scatter plot, we have on the x-axis third party as a percentage of the total units, and then on the y-axis we have revenue per hour. So each blue circle in the scatter plot represents a individual clinic location in the data set. And it's clear when you look at it that most of the clinics with the highest revenue per hour have a fairly low third party percentage. And when we bring in a trend line, it becomes even more clear. The more third party as a percentage of your total practice, the harder it is to have a high revenue per hour number. Okay, so now let's take a look at some specific clinics to see kind of the impact of what third party has had on these clinics, and some other examples we'll get into of how some practices have dealt with it and some strategies they've employed. So the first case study here is from a practice that's relatively new and has relied heavily on third-party referrals since the beginning of the practice, which is something I think we all agree on. It's the right thing to do when you're just getting your practice off the ground. You should welcome referrals from any and all and try to be in network pretty much wherever possible. There's some exceptions to that. And a lot of the focus on the managed care issue, understandably, and the impacts, it comes from what is this doing to the financials or the business, the business model, an understandable concern. But another area that we really need to be concerned with is schedule capacity. So as you can see, this practice has grown. It's quite a bit in the first few years. You've got the third-party units in green and the private pay units in blue. So they've shown nice growth, but a whole lot of third party in there. The yellow line represents the third party percentages. So that continues to grow. So the problem for this particular practice is a schedule capacity issue, which is something that we measure using our KPI tool that we've developed here. So schedule utilization rate is a measurement of how full your schedule is looking out into the future. And we generally like to see that number somewhere around 70 to 75%. If you're looking out a couple weeks, that gives you some room to fit in private pay patients that need to be seen, or things that arise just in day out of running a practice. But in the case of this particular practice that's so inundated with third parties that they're essentially at 100% capacity for the next 4 weeks, which causes all sorts of problems because you'll have a real challenge finding time for your private pay patients. And in a practice in this particular situation, we would highly recommend evaluating each third-party contract and likely implement some sort of divestment strategy or removing themselves from the third parties, particularly the ones where the reimbursements are poor or the required service is too high, and to drop out of the contracts where it doesn't make sense to participate to make more room for private pay patients. Okay, so another example we have here is from a multi-location practice where third party hasn't historically made up a large percentage of the business. But as you can see here, again, we have the same kind of chart here where we've got private pay units in blue and third party in green. So the third party has never historically been particularly high, but that, as you can see with the yellow line there, it was growing as a percentage of the total units each year. And it got up to, approaching 10% of total units as of 2020, which was a little higher than this practice was comfortable with. So this is an example of a practice that decided to implement the Access Hearing program in early 2021, almost exactly as Dan described. And there was some early success upon launching that program within the practice, which gave this practice the confidence to essentially completely divest from the third party, all third party contracts. And there's a handful of exceptions there, which is why the units are not zero. But for all intents and purposes, this practice does not work with third parties associated with any Medicare Advantage plan. Okay, so what has the impact here been on profitability? Well, they've seen a nice improvement in gross margin per unit from the 2018 to 2020, kind of the ramp up period of third parties. We saw average gross margin per unit of 1079, and that's all the way up to 1327 since that change has been made. So a 23% increase in gross margin per unit with the implementation of Access Hearing, along with a almost entirely complete divestment strategy. Having a program like Access is critical if you're going to implement a strategy like this. Okay, so here's another example of a practice that has had success with the Access Hearing program. This is a long-standing single location practice in a semi-rural market. In the case here, we have data going back to 2017, even though the practice has been around longer than that. That's the data we're working with. And what's unique about this situation is that there was one particular third-party contract that was responsible for the majority of the referrals and the third-party units in this practice. And this was not a particularly good contract, poor reimbursements and lots of service requirements that were not acceptable. So in 2021, they also implemented the Access Hearing program and divested from that one particular contract while remaining in a few others that are a bit more palatable. So this is what we would refer to as a partial divestment strategy, which is a great place to start before you keep looking at the other contracts and eventually, hopefully, have enough private pay business to justify dropping or divesting entirely. And again, from a profitability standpoint, we see a nice increase. The 2018 to 2020 period showed gross margin per unit of 1593. And since the implementation of Access and the partial divestment strategy, that's up to 1773 per unit, which is an 11% increase. Okay, so I have one more example here to show you. This practice is relatively new, but has seen strong revenue growth in the last few years. And as we can see here, the third-party units have made up a fairly sizable chunk of the overall business since the beginning. And that's while you're getting things off the ground, while you're building your database, building your business. That's as good of a use case for working with third parties as I think you'll find. And now this practice is well over the revenue thresholds that Dan mentioned earlier. So this practice has options. They have enough private pay business to where they have some decisions to make, and they can, along with the implementation of an alternative treatment plan like Access, they can be very selective with the contracts they participate in, and make those types of strategic decisions because they have that private pay business that they've built up. And it's been nice to see, although totally expected, with that third-party percentage falling in recent years, the gross margin per unit has risen sharply. So we would highly recommend, if you're a practice in this particular situation, to implement a divestment strategy along with putting together that alternative treatment plan. Okay, so in summary, I think that what the data shows here is that there is a case to be made to remove yourself from the managed care space under certain circumstances. So as Dan mentioned earlier, when your revenues, per provider reach 500,000, you should give each of your third-party contracts a really hard look. And when you exceed 750K annually, you should really consider dropping out altogether and focusing on private pay. And of course, the other big consideration here that we've talked about is, schedule capacity issues. If third-party referrals and patients are precluding you from doing more private pay business, that is something you really need to take seriously. And when you've made the decision to divest, it's really important to do so strategically. So I always recommend to start with the low-hanging fruit, contracts that have poor reimbursements or otherwise hard to work with for you or the patient. From there, you could really think about the true benefits and costs of working with any given third-party company. And no matter what your strategy is, even if it's to remain contracted with everyone, we believe that you need a compelling alternative treatment plan like Access Hearing. So an obvious question you might find yourself asking was something like, let's say I drop all third parties, how much additional private pay business will I need to do to make up that difference, make up the lost margin? So we took a look at all the practices within our data set where they had a third party percentage of 10% or higher. So we're looking at practices that to one degree or another are being impacted by third party. And it turns out that all it would take on average would be 1.87 additional private pay sales per month per full-time provider to completely offset the lost gross margin from generated, from the third parties currently. And I had to check that number a couple of times as it seemed a bit low. And to be clear, if your TPA percentage is much higher than the average, 60, 70%, like we see out there from time to time, the number of additional patients could be higher, could be as high as 8 or 9, I think is what we've seen. But on average, it's less than 2 additional private sales per month per full-time provider. I'd be happy to sit down with any of you individually, by the way, and discuss how this math might work for your practice, as it will vary depending on your third-party percentage and the average margins you generate from your private pay sales. So that said, I highly suggest that you focus your time, attention, and marketing dollars on growing the private pay side of your business so that a divestment strategy of any kind is a possibility. And the answer, no matter what you decide to do, the best path forward is always to grow your private pay business. And the best way to do that, we believe in this hyper competitive market in 2022 and beyond, is to make sure that you have a compelling alternative treatment plan in place, like the Access Hearing program, to offer your patients. And when you successfully grow your private pay business, you have options, which is a great place to be as a business owner or a practice manager. Because if you don't have significant private pay business to rely on, you actually don't have much of a choice here. And you're essentially at the mercy of these third-party companies, which are, not exactly your friend. So that is it.
Well, I think that was the understatement of the whole webinar. Thank you very much for that. I was struck by your statement of, or use of the term, a compelling alternative treatment plan, because the compelling is the key to that, isn't it? In making sure that you have something that is well crafted to be able to say apples, oranges, to be able to say, this is what you're missing out on. That's why we have this. That's really the magic in all of that. When we put something together that makes people go, oh, I really, really like that. And thank you very much for sharing the math. I'm struck at 1.87 sales for that provider. That's extraordinary. So thank you for sharing that. So we do have some questions, and we do have some time, very brief time for questions, but the one that I'd like to make sure that we're able to move forward with before we say goodbye to everybody. We have one that says, if a patient has a plan where they must use their insurance to receive a third-party benefit, why would they go from a plan B from us when their insurance won't pay for that? And Dan, we talk about this all the time.
Yes.
Will, I think the key is the compelling part. Dan, would you like to talk about why anyone would make that choice?
Yeah, so I think we have to again go back to our product or our contract differentiation. We have discount plans, we have defined benefits, and then we have the Medicare plans, which usually includes some out of pocket. The most difficult ones to have a compelling argument against, of course, are people that have a total benefit where it's nothing out of pocket, the insurance company is paying it all. But we have to always remember, if I am an individual that has an insurance benefit, I am still a consumer. And if I find something that has better value for my money, even though it might have some out of pocket, I have the right as a consumer to do that. And I think as professionals, and we're trying to get outcomes for our patients, we have to look at what products are being offered in that plan and what is my reimbursement. And so at that point in time, we have to show an alternative plan and let them make a choice. I'm not saying they will always choose the alternative, but I'm saying in most cases they do. We saw that in our case study when we did this initial pilot program. The patients very often choose the very best plan for themselves. So yes, it's very difficult if it's a full benefit and you can't bill for that benefit. That is the most difficult one, but those are rare. And so I always caution people to size the problem. In other words, is this happening once a month? Is this happening once a year? It's happening once a week, because oftentimes we find that we make decisions and base our policies and programs based on a small sample size. And what we need to do is try to get to doing a sample for the general population and the general market rather than those specifics, because it's pretty few that we see out there that you really can't sell against.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, there's a certain percentage of folks that are always going to call that 800 number on the back of their Medicare Advantage card, and they're going to go to the place that has the lowest out-of-pocket place option for them. But I think there's a significant subset of patients out there that are looking for more in a hearing healthcare experience, not just a transaction. So that's why I think developing all sorts of compelling alternatives and along with regular premium products and services, I think there's plenty of reason why people will choose, to do business outside of their insurance benefit.
And I also want to talk about the false narrative that's being put forward by the retail organizations and the TPAs. And that false narrative is that if you have a hearing loss, all you need is a hearing test and a hearing aid, and that problem solved. And what we know as healthcare professionals, and what is incumbent upon us, is to educate our patients about the healthcare journey. Sensory neural hearing loss, age-related hearing loss is a chronic health issue that is with us for life. Things will change as our lives change. They need a professional to guide them through that process. And I think when they understand that and they understand the value that the professional brings to the formula, suddenly it's apples and oranges. And that's where we're getting to.
We are out of time. Thank you so much for attending. I know we have so many questions, but this is what I recommend. You're going to be receiving some correspondence via email from the panelists, the companies that put this together, and it will open up the opportunity for you to be able to contact us directly and have all of these answers provided to be able to go through specifics of your particular practice. So we're not using generalities or blanket statements, and we can help support you and guide you through making these data-driven decisions and even help you with the math if you'd like. So thank you again. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you all for showing up. We appreciate you being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.